Thick mud squished underneath the men's feet as they crept through the cemetery on a foggy, moonless night. This squishing sound was seemingly all that could be heard for miles, other than the occasional hooting of an owl and the steady pitter-patter of drizzling rain falling down around them. The doctor paused every so often to shake off the damp earth clinging to his boots as his companion, Igor, lurched on ahead of him.
"This one, master,"
Igor called out, standing next to a grave marker. The doctor adjusted his glasses, wiping the mist from his lenses, then plodded towards the hunchbacked, deformed creature who served as his laboratory assistant. Peering through the haze, he studied the dates on the tombstone. "No, Igor, you fool," he sighed. "Not fresh enough, and besides that, too old." The doctor's process, as he called it, required a body that had not been in the ground for a considerable period of time, and what's more, this body had to be that of someone who had been relatively young at the time of his or her death. "Aha," the doctor murmured as he approached a grave underneath a large oak tree. Now here was a promising candidate, a young man of just 19 years, and the grave appeared freshly dug. "Igor," he rasped, "get over here. This might be the one." Igor shambled over to the grave, dragging his club foot along behind him.
"Yes, master,"
Igor said excitedly as he took the shovel he'd been carrying and began to dig. It wasn't long before the telltale wooden thunk of the shovel signaled that they had hit the casket. The bastards hadn't even buried him deeply enough, the doctor thought to himself. "Out of the way, you cretin, before you damage the specimen." He shoved Igor aside and knelt down, leaning into the shallow grave and brushing away dirt. "Hand me the pry bar," he commanded. Igor produced a long metal bar, which the doctor used to carefully ease open the lid of the coffin, working his way around each edge. With the lid loosened, Igor reached into the cavity and dragged it to the side, only to reveal a gruesome sight. The cadaver had no head. The doctor grimaced. "Damn it all," he muttered to no one in particular. They had been looking for a new test subject for 3 weeks now, with no success. Perhaps it was time for more drastic measures. There was one place likely to have a supply of fresh corpses, the city morgue. A perfect place to find a suitable subject for the doctor's experiment, an attempt to raise the dead. The Man Who Made a Monster, a bite-sized fright. This series contains disturbing content. Listener discretion is advised. It was now nearly 1 o'clock in the morning as the doctor, Victor Frankenstein, and Igor arrived at the morgue. There was no night watchman, thankfully. Igor smashed the handle off the back door with a wrench they had retrieved from the doctor's estate, a metallic whanging sound echoing through the streets.
"Damn it, Igor, not so loud,"
the doctor hissed. Igor pushed the door open with a groaning creak.
"Sorry, master,"
Igor whispered. The overwhelming stench of death was readily apparent as the pair stepped into the building. The doctor coughed, holding a handkerchief to his face as Igor lit an oil lamp. "This way," the doctor gestured, pointing to a row of cold stone slabs, each holding a body covered in a sheet. The first corpse was no good, an elderly man. The doctor's attempts to reanimate the elderly had been particularly fruitless, so he quickly thought better of using this particular specimen for the experiment. The second corpse was that of a young woman, but the poor wretch was lame, with a deformed leg, somewhat like Igor's. She might work, the doctor thought, but she's not ideal. The third corpse was a man who looked to be in his late 30s, possibly early 40s. He looked to be in relatively good condition. aside from the fact that he was dead, of course. The doctor pondered the cause of the man's demise as he studied the body. No matter. He would do.
"This is the one, Igor,"
the doctor said, nodding at his assistant. Igor nodded back and retrieved a large roll of sackcloth, which he began to unroll onto the floor.
"Yes, master,"
he replied, as if in a trance, while dragging the man's body onto the cloth, rolling him up like a grotesque carpet. The pair lugged their peculiar prize out of the morgue and to the doctor's waiting carriage. With a crack of the whip, they were off, back to the doctor's secluded mansion, nestled beyond the hills just outside the city, far away from prying eyes. The doctor's laboratory was located on the 3rd floor of his sprawling estate, a converted castle that had been in his family for centuries. The lab where he had been perfecting his process as of late was a labyrinth of metal monstrosities, with all manner of cables and contraptions intricately woven throughout. It all led to the center of the large room, where an operating table, constructed out of steel, was mounted atop a platform underneath a large skylight situated in the ceiling. With any luck, the light rain that had been lingering since the past evening would soon pick up, producing a lightning storm, and thus providing the critical jolt of electricity needed to sufficiently power the doctor's machine, and hopefully bring this cadaver back to life. Dr. Frankenstein strapped his subject down to the table and placed a gleaming silver crown of sorts over his head. The crown, hooked up to complex machinery in the doctor's lab, was also linked to a lightning rod atop the roof via a lengthy maze of wiring. A crack of thunder bellowed in the distance. "Igor," the doctor called out, "prepare yourself, the storm is picking up." The doctor walked to a window, peering out into the early morning sky, which was still pitch black. A bolt of lightning flashed, then a second, followed by more thunder, a resounding boom this time. Suddenly, sparks exploded and sizzled in the laboratory as the doctor turned and rushed to the operating table. Lightning had struck his device. Electricity surged into the lab. Gears and dials on the machines span wildly as the crown strapped to the head of the corpse continued to throw sparks about the room. The dead man's body spasmed and shook, one limb, then another, his back arched and his body contorted. And then the machinery died down, whirring to a disappointing halt. The doctor beheld it all in dismay. Had this experiment failed too? Suddenly, the eyes of the dead man opened wide, and he slowly turned his head in one direction, then the other, staring at the doctor. Success! He was alive. Dr. Frankenstein rushed to the platform, eyes wide in amazement. The dead man groaned, mouth agape, seemingly in confusion. Of course, it was only natural. Up until now, he'd been dead, after all. Igor twitched nervously, unsure what to make of their creation. The man pulled at his restraints, trying to stretch his arms, his groaning growing more agitated. "Easy, friend," the doctor said. "You're in no danger here. Can you understand me?" He peered into the man's eyes. "I have brought you back to life, you see. You are a miracle of modern science." The doctor cackled. At last, he'd done it. He paced about the laboratory, his mind racing. What to do first? He'd contact the newspaper. No, he couldn't. News of the missing cadaver would surely soon get out, and he'd be a prime suspect if his own scientific article, about an experiment involving a corpse of all things, were to be released this early. He would instead write to his friend and colleague at the university in Germany, he thought to himself. Now that he had perfected his process, perhaps he could travel there and be awarded a grant to continue his research, and nobody would need to know how he'd come by the test subjects involved in the experiments leading up to this astonishing discovery. Behind him, there was a sudden, violent crash. Igor shrieked in panic. The doctor turned to see the man now standing in front of the platform, having snapped clean through the leather restraints on the operating table. The man lurched forward, knocking over equipment. "By the gods!" the doctor exclaimed. "How could he have broken free of his bonds?" The man turned towards Igor, reaching out and snatching him by the neck. Igor gasped, flailing at the man in vain. "No! Release him at once!" the doctor shouted, grabbing a rifle from the wall and aiming it at the monstrosity that he had brought back from the dead. The creature turned towards the doctor, hurling Igor to the floor. The doctor's loyal servant crawled away as the revived corpse lumbered towards him, his eyes full of rage. "Stay back!" the doctor shouted, snapping the lever of his rifle forward, then back, loading a round into the chamber. The creature roared, taking another step forward, and the doctor fired, blasting him in the shoulder and causing him to recoil in pain. But that did not stop him from advancing. With surprising speed, he was upon the doctor before another bullet could be readied. The monstrous creation slapped the rifle aside, throwing the doctor against the wall as the gun clattered across the stone floor. Two meaty hands wrapped around the doctor's neck, squeezing as he was pressed against the wall. Frankenstein clawed at the monster's arms, but it was no use. His vision began to fade. Suddenly, there was a sickening thud, and the creature released his hold on the doctor, who immediately sank to the floor, gasping for air, clutching at the marks on his neck. The monstrous abomination groaned and staggered backwards. Igor had reappeared, holding a shovel. He took yet another swing, landing a blow on the side of the creature of their own making, then another, which hit the reanimated corpse squarely on the head. The sinister being fell down to his knees, noises coming from him in an unintelligible cacophony of sound. Dr. Frankenstein recovered the rifle and readied it. "Stand aside, Igor," he said matter-of-factly. He stepped towards the fiend who glared up at him, hatred apparent in his eyes. The doctor lowered the rifle, pointing it at his head. "Sorry, friend. You were a mistake, it seems." There was a loud bang, and the creature's world went dark. The story of Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was written by English author Mary Shelley and published in 1818. The novel was initially released anonymously when Shelley was just 20 years old and told the tale of Victor Frankenstein, a young scientist conducting strange experiments, ultimately creating a sentient creature in the process. Told via 3 different narratives, the book is widely regarded as one of the most influential novels of all time, although it was both well received as well as disregarded at the time of its publication. Shelley came up with the idea during a visit to a villa in Switzerland 2 years prior to the novel's publication, where she met famous author Lord Byron. He proposed that each of the guests present write a ghost story. At first, Shelley was unable to think of a story. However, during a discussion about the nature of life, she noted that perhaps the notion of a corpse being reanimated could provide the inspiration for a particularly frightening story. This ultimately led to the creation of the novel by the name of Frankenstein. The tale of Frankenstein and his creature has been adapted dozens upon dozens of times over the years, most famously by James Whale in his popular 1931 Universal Pictures film, simply entitled Frankenstein. The movie, starring Boris Karloff as the creature, was wildly successful. Bela Lugosi, who of course starred as Dracula that same year for Universal, had hoped to play Henry Frankenstein in the original concept for the film. He was asked, however, to play a version of the monster and reportedly turned it down, although more recent evidence suggests that he may have been unceremoniously removed from the project alongside the intended original director once James Whale took over. The personality of the monster, originally planned to be that of a simplistic killing machine, was altered and provided with some measure of humanity in keeping with the spirit of Mary Shelley's story. The movie does differ from Shelley's novel with respect to exactly how the creature is brought to life. In Whale's film, as well as in many other adaptations, the monster is constructed out of body parts assembled from various corpses and reanimated with electricity. In Shelley's novel, the mysterious process by which Victor Frankenstein brings the creature to life is never described in detail, and his creation is painstakingly assembled using raw materials from, as Shelley writes, the dissecting room and the slaughterhouse. Many scenes from the 1931 film were controversial for the time. The scene in which the monster accidentally drowns a little girl after throwing her into a lake, for instance, was cut out by the state censorship boards in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York. Universal cut the footage from the original camera negative, making it likely that it would be lost forever. In the 1980s, however, the missing footage was discovered in the British National Film Archive and has subsequently been reincorporated into modern copies of the film. Certain lines of dialogue were also targeted by censors for being blasphemous, such as this line by Henry Frankenstein, "In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God." Nonetheless, the movie was a smash hit, with Boris Karloff's legendary portrayal of the monster cementing him as a horror icon. The film spawned numerous sequels, including the 1935 follow-up Bride of Frankenstein, featuring Elsa Lanchester in a dual role as Mary Shelley as well as the monster's bride. The movie was a critical and commercial success, although it dealt with its fair share of problems as well. Censorship boards complained about the number of murders in the film, both on-screen and off, blasphemous imagery, too much of Lanchester's breasts being visible in her role as Mary Shelley, and even suggestions of necrophilia in a scene where the monster stares longingly at the yet unanimated body of the bride. Despite this, the movie has gone on to become a bona fide classic, much like its predecessor. The bride, with her funnel-shaped hairdo and white lightning traced shapes on each side, has become an iconic character and symbol herself. Frankenstein's monster, along with the bride, have arguably become the most famous and recognizable of the so-called universal monsters, which also includes the aforementioned Dracula, as well as the Phantom of the Opera, the Mummy, the Invisible Man, the Wolf Man, and the creature from the Black Lagoon. Although James Whale's film is perhaps the most famous adaptation of Shelley's story, it was not the first. The tale was adapted for the stage in 1823 and then again in 1826, and was even the subject of a musical burlesque in 1887. In 1910, Edison Studios, founded by inventor and entrepreneur Thomas Edison, produced the first film based on the story, also entitled simply Frankenstein. In 1994, Kenneth Branagh starred in and directed Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, featuring Robert De Niro as the Creation. The film is considered to be one of the most faithful adaptations of the original work, although it differs from Shelley's novel in several ways and includes numerous additions to the plot. The movie was not particularly well received. Screenwriter Frank Darabont, famous in the 1980s for writing A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Blob, and The Fly 2, called it the best script I ever wrote and the worst movie I've ever seen. A long-running series by British studio Hammer Films focused on the character of Dr. Frankenstein, frequently played by Peter Cushing rather than on the monster. These films, produced between 1957 and 1974, are primarily stand-alone pieces and are only tenuously connected to one another. Other works have also taken inspiration from Mary Shelley's novel. H.P. Lovecraft's Herbert West Reanimator, which was adapted into a horror comedy film in 1985 by Stuart Gordon, was intended as a parody of Shelley's work, according to the author. The short story, which was originally released in episodic form in 1922, was considered by Lovecraft to be one of the worst things he ever wrote, largely due to the serial format. Regardless, it is one of his most well-known works, and the aforementioned film adaptation, starring Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton, is widely considered a cult classic amongst horror aficionados. So what is it about Mary Shelley's monster that has retained such ghoulish appeal? The character is one of the most widely recognized icons in horror and has influenced a massive amount of creative works, including music, television shows, comedic skits, comic books, theater productions, cartoons, derivative novels, toys, games, and more. Boris Karloff's legend return as the creature surely has something to do with it. Perhaps there's something more to the entire topic, something that stirs the macabre imagination lurking inside all of us. Frankenstein has not always been described as pure horror over the years, but many have in fact defined it as science fiction, making it one of the first works in that genre. Shelley's original novel contains a dire warning. The author's subheading, "The Modern Prometheus," refers to the titan who stole fire from the gods and was punished eternally in return. Victor Frankenstein, similarly, wields a power that he was never meant to have, and this power eventually consumes not only him, but everyone around him, including the creature itself. Perhaps it is this sinister warning, timeless and ever more relevant in modern times, with the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning, that primarily gives Shelley's story its longevity. Let us all take heed, for our greatest achievements might also result in the creation of our worst monsters. We would love to hear your own thoughts and ideas about manufactured monsters and corpse-based creations. If you have enjoyed this episode, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Pixel Elixir, and on Instagram at Bite-Sized Frights. You can also subscribe at bitesizedfrights.com so that you never miss any of our terrifying tales. This has been a Pixel Elixir production, narrated by Chris K. Thank you for listening. Until the next bite, my friends.